toxic mother-in-law claimed I wasn't their family just before our vacation. My husband and I left them at the airport and took our own trip instead. For years, I tried to build a bridge with my mother-in-law, Carol. She never outright said she didn't like me, but her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Subtle insults disguised as advice, cold stares across the dinner table, and those accidental exclusions whenever plans were made. It all painted a clear picture. Carol's disapproval wasn't just passive. It was a storm cloud that loomed over every interaction I had with her, casting a shadow over my otherwise happy marriage to David, her son. But I endured it. I bit my tongue, smiled politely, and convinced myself that time would change things. After all, she was family. Or so I thought. A week before the long-planned family vacation to the Caribbean, Carol called me while I was prepping for work. At first, I thought it was a simple call to confirm last-minute details, maybe a polite, "looking forward to seeing you." Her tone, sweet and dripping with something I couldn't place, immediately set me on edge. "Hi, dear," she began, and I knew then this wasn't going to be good. Carol rarely called me dear unless she had something particularly cutting to say. "Just wanted to chat about the trip. David's father and I were reviewing the budget, and we realized it doesn't quite make sense for us to cover your expenses. You know, since you're not really family." I froze, clutching the phone as her words echoed in my head. Not really family? After 5 years of marriage to her son? After bending over backward to be part of every holiday, event, and family dinner, even when I wasn't wanted? My heart raced, and a million retorts flashed through my mind, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing my cool would only give her more ammunition. "That's fine," I said, my voice level despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I'll pay for myself." "Oh, good," she replied, sounding almost disappointed that I hadn't fought back. "Glad you understand. I'll let David know as well." And with that, she hung up, leaving me standing in the kitchen, phone still clutched in my hand, trying to process the full weight of her words. When David came home that night, I told him everything. His reaction was immediate and fierce. "She said what?" he asked, his voice rising as he paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "She actually said you're not family? After all this time? After everything you've done?" I nodded, tears threatening to spill over, but I quickly blinked them away. I didn't want to cry over Carol. She didn't deserve that kind of power over me. "It's fine," I said, though it clearly wasn't. "I told her I'd pay for myself." "That's not the point," David snapped, his anger palpable. "She's been treating you like this for years, and I've tried to stay out of it. But this? No. This crosses the line. We're not going." I shook my head, stopping him mid-pace. "No," I said firmly. "We're going. But we're doing it on our terms." David frowned, confusion mixing with his frustration. "What does that mean?" That was when the idea hit me. If Carol didn't see me as part of her family, then maybe it was time to show her exactly what that felt like. "We'll go to the airport with them like nothing's wrong," I explained, my voice steady as I outlined the plan forming in my mind. "But at the last minute, we'll leave. We'll ditch them and take our own trip somewhere else." David stared at me for a moment, his anger giving way to something else, amusement. A slow grin spread across his face as he began to nod. "You're serious," he said, almost in awe. "Completely," I replied, my determination growing. "If I'm not family enough for her, then we'll show her what it's like when we step out of the family picture altogether." David chuckled, his grin widening. "All right then," he said. "Let's do it." And just like that, the plan was set. David didn't need much convincing. His anger over Carol's comment mirrored my own, but his resolve to stand by me only strengthened the bond we shared. "She's crossed the line this time," he said as we sat together on the couch that evening. "If she doesn't see you as family, then she doesn't get to have us on this trip. Simple as that." His voice was sharp with determination, and for the first time since Carol's phone call, I felt a flicker of vindication. I knew he meant it. The plan started small. Initially, David suggested we simply cancel the trip altogether. But the more we talked, the clearer it became that canceling wasn't enough. We wanted her to feel the sting of exclusion, the same way her words had stung me. That's when the idea struck him. "We'll show up at the airport like everything's fine," David said, his lips curving into a mischievous grin. "And then, just before their flight boards, we'll slip away and catch a different flight." I stared at him, equal parts shocked and amused. "You mean ditch them? Like, literally just leave?" "Exactly," he said, leaning forward with growing enthusiasm. Let's make it clear that if she doesn't see you as family, then we'll respect her wish and stay out of her little vacation altogether. I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity of it. As the idea sank in, I felt my apprehension give way to excitement. Okay, I said, warming to the plan. But where do we go? We'll need to book something last minute. David didn't even hesitate. He grabbed his phone and started scrolling through travel sites with the focus of a man on a mission. How does San Diego sound? He asked after a few minutes, turning the screen toward me. Sun, beaches, great food, and best of all, no Carol. I glanced at the photos of sunny beaches and vibrant cityscapes. It sounded perfect. San Diego it is, I said, the words settling into my chest like a bomb. From that moment on, our plan went into full swing. We booked flights and a hotel under the guise of researching the Caribbean trip, careful not to arouse suspicion. We packed lightly, making sure our luggage looked like it was meant for the island, but kept a few versatile pieces tucked away for the cooler California weather. Every step we took felt like a small victory, a quiet rebellion against the years of judgment and exclusion Carol had inflicted on me. In the days leading up to the trip, Carol's calls became more frequent, her smugness growing with every conversation. Hi, dear, she chirped during one particularly grating call. Just wanted to remind you to confirm your portion of the payment for the hotel. It's such an exclusive resort. I'd hate for there to be any issues. Of course, I replied smoothly, forcing myself to stay calm. I'll make sure it's taken care of. Oh, good, she said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. I just know you'll appreciate all the work we've put into this. It's not every day someone gets to join our family traditions, after all. I bit my tongue so hard it almost bled. Carol was practically bursting with self-satisfaction, oblivious to the fact that we were planning to flip her precious vacation on its head. Every call made me more certain that our plan was the right move. On the morning of the trip, the house was buzzing with energy. David's family had arranged a group car service to the airport, and we piled in together with forced smiles. Carol, as expected, barely acknowledged me. Instead, she focused all her attention on David and his siblings, doling out last-minute reminders about passports and luggage like a general preparing for battle. Normally, her coldness would have stung, but this time, I didn't care. I had a secret weapon, and the thought of what was coming kept a quiet smile on my face. The airport was packed, and navigating through security only heightened the anticipation. David and I exchanged glances as we approached the gate, silently confirming that we were ready. Carol was in her element, chattering about the resort and how much she'd sacrificed to make the trip happen. I stayed quiet, nodding politely as my heart raced with adrenaline. Remember, David murmured as we sat down near the gate, we'll wait until boarding starts. By the time they realize we're gone, it'll be too late for them to figure anything out. I nodded, clutching my boarding pass to San Diego like a lifeline. As the boarding call for their flight echoed through the terminal, I felt a surge of excitement and nerves. It was almost time. Soon, Carol would find out exactly what it felt like to be left out of the family. The morning of the trip, David and I arrived at the airport with his family, rolling our suitcases behind us like everything was perfectly normal. Carol greeted us with her usual tight-lipped smile, scanning me up and down as though she was searching for a flaw. Her eyes lingered on my suitcase, and I could practically hear her thinking, I hope she packed appropriately for once. She said nothing directly to me. Of course. Why waste words when a dismissive glance would suffice? I forced myself to smile and turned my attention to David's siblings, who were chatting about their plans for the week. Despite the tension Carol brought into every interaction, the rest of the family had always been relatively kind to me. Still, none of them had ever gone out of their way to defend me when Carol's coldness crossed the line. Whether out of fear of rocking the boat or a simple lack of awareness, they always stayed silent, and that silence spoke volumes. As we moved through security and found seats near the gate, I felt the familiar pang of anxiety Carol always managed to trigger. But beneath it was something else: excitement. David and I exchanged a quick glance, and his lips curled into a subtle smirk. He knew I was counting down the minutes until we executed our plan, and his confidence steadied me. Carol, oblivious as ever, chattered on about the resort. It's such an exclusive place, she said loudly, as though anyone within earshot needed to know just how luxurious her vacation was going to be. I made sure we got the best rooms available. Of course, we'll need to stick to the itinerary. I don't want anyone wandering off and ruining the schedule. Her eyes flicked to me when she said that last part, and I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from snapping. When the boarding call finally came, my heart began to race. David leaned toward me and whispered, "Ready?" I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Want to grab a coffee before we head on?" he asked casually, his voice just loud enough for the family to hear. Carol glanced up from her phone, clearly annoyed. "You don't have time for coffee," she said sharply. "Boarding's already started." David smiled, unbothered. "We'll be quick," he said, taking my hand and leading me away before she could argue. My heart pounded as we walked down the terminal, leaving the gate behind us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to call after us or realize what we were doing, but no one did. The moment we turned the corner toward our new gate, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Are we really doing this?" I whispered, still half dazed by the reality of what we were about to pull off. David grinned, squeezing my hand. "Oh, we're doing this." Our new gate was already bustling with passengers boarding the flight to San Diego. We handed over our tickets, and as we stepped onto the plane, a wave of exhilaration washed over me. This wasn't just an escape from the vacation, it was an escape from years of being dismissed, undermined, and treated as less than. As we settled into our seats, David pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen as he composed a message to the family group chat. He handed me the phone so I could read it before he sent it. "Since my love isn't family enough, we've decided to skip the trip. Enjoy your vacation." I chuckled, nodding my approval. He hit send, then immediately turned off his phone, tucking it into his bag. "Done," he said with a satisfied sigh, leaning back in his seat. I followed his lead, settling into my seat as the plane began to taxi. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. Free from Carol's judgment, free from the constant effort of trying to prove myself, free to just enjoy my life with the man I loved. As the plane lifted off, I glanced out the window and smiled. The Caribbean could wait, San Diego was calling, and I couldn't wait to see where this new chapter would take us. San Diego welcomed us with open arms. From the moment we stepped off the plane, the tension that had followed us for years, Carol's constant judgment, the strained interactions, the feeling of never being enough, seemed to melt away. The crisp ocean breeze felt like freedom itself, and as we checked into a boutique beachfront hotel, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this light. Our room had a balcony overlooking the water, where the waves rolled in with a soothing rhythm. "This," David said as he dropped our bags and stepped onto the balcony, taking a deep breath, "is exactly what we needed." He turned to me with a smile, and for the first time in days, I felt my heart unclench. That first evening, we walked hand in hand along the beach as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The sound of the waves mingled with the hum of people enjoying the evening, but for me, it was just the two of us. No biting remarks, no judgmental glances, no Carol. It was bliss. Later, we indulged in a candlelit dinner at a seafood restaurant overlooking the harbor. David ordered a bottle of wine, and as the server poured our glasses, I found myself laughing at the absurdity of it all. "Do you think they've realized yet?" I asked, my curiosity finally bubbling to the surface. David chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, they've realized," he said, his tone smug. "But we'll deal with that later." Our phones remained off, a deliberate choice that felt both rebellious and necessary. David occasionally peeked at his email using the hotel's tablet, smirking as he scrolled. "They're not happy," he said during one of these checks, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied grin. I didn't press for details. Whatever chaos was brewing on the other end wasn't my concern. For once, I wasn't the one trying to smooth things over or salvage relationships that felt one-sided. Carol could stew all she wanted, it was our time now. The days that followed were nothing short of magical. We explored Balboa Park, strolling through its lush gardens and soaking in the charm of its Spanish architecture. We spent lazy mornings sipping coffee by the ocean and adventurous afternoons hiking the trails at Torrey Pines, the cliffs offering breathtaking views of the Pacific. At night, we ventured into the city to try new restaurants, David daring me to sample dishes I'd never considered before. "This is what vacations should feel like," he said one evening as we shared a plate of tacos from a local stand. "No stress. No drama. Just us." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. He was right. For the first time in years, the only opinions that mattered were ours. There was no need to tiptoe around someone else's expectations or endure veiled insults disguised as conversation. I wasn't trying to prove myself, and David wasn't caught in the middle of family tension. It was just us, laughing, exploring, and enjoying the life we'd built together. San Diego became our sanctuary. Each sunset we watched from our balcony felt like a little victory, a reminder that we'd taken back control of our happiness. And with every passing day, I felt the weight of Carol's judgment lift a little more. She no longer occupied space in my mind, and for the first time, I realized how exhausting it had been to live under her shadow. When David suggested extending our trip by a day, I didn't hesitate. "Let's do it," I said, grinning as I leaned back into my chair on the balcony. "What's the rush to go back?" "There isn't one," he replied, raising his glass to me. "Here's to making our own traditions." We clinked glasses, the sound blending with the distant crash of the waves. San Diego wasn't just a vacation. It was a reminder that we didn't need Carol's approval or anyone else's validation to live our lives. We were enough just as we were. The serenity of our San Diego escape came to an abrupt end the moment we turned our phones back on. After 5 days of blissful disconnection, the onslaught of messages hit us like a tidal wave. Text after text, voicemail after voicemail. It was all from David's family, each message angrier than the last. The first one I saw, from Carol, set the tone. "How could you do this, David? Do you know how much you embarrass me?" David scrolled through his phone, his expression unreadable as the messages poured in. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. I peeked at his screen and saw more texts from his siblings. "Why would you guys pull something like this?" one wrote. "Mom is furious," said another. My chest tightened at those words. "Driving a wedge." It was Carol's favorite accusation, one she'd hinted at countless times during arguments with David about our relationship. Seeing it parroted by his siblings stung more than I wanted to admit. David must have noticed my silence because he reached over and squeezed my hand. "Let them vent," he said firmly. "They need to understand they can't treat you like this anymore. You're my wife, and if they can't respect that, they don't get to have me in their lives either." I nodded, trying to focus on his unwavering support, but the pit in my stomach refused to go away. No matter how justified our actions had been, I couldn't shake the guilt that crept in as I read through the messages. Carol had always been dramatic, but the sheer volume of accusations and insults she was now hurling made it clear this wasn't over. Later that evening, David and I sat on the balcony, our phones sitting face down on the table between us. "She's probably telling anyone who will listen that I've ruined the family," I said bitterly, swirling the last of my wine in my glass. David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Let her," he said simply. "Anyone who really knows us won't buy into her nonsense." "But what about your siblings?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "They're already taking her side." David's jaw tightened, and he looked out at the ocean for a long moment before replying. "They're not taking her side. They're avoiding the real issue because it's easier to blame you than to admit that she's the problem. They'll come around eventually. And if they don't," he trailed off, his eyes meeting mine, "then that's on them, not you." I wanted to believe him, but the doubt lingered. As much as I resented Carol for her treatment of me, I didn't want to be the reason David's family fell apart. The messages from his siblings replayed in my mind like a broken record, each one accusing me of being the instigator. The next morning, Carol called. The phone vibrated on the nightstand, her name lighting up the screen like a siren. David silenced it without hesitation, tossing the phone back onto the bed. "She's relentless," I muttered, half admiring her commitment to the cause of making my life miserable. "She's predictable," David corrected, his tone calm but firm. "She's mad that she lost control, and now she's scrambling to get it back. But we're not playing her game anymore." He was right, of course. Carol's fury wasn't just about the vacation, it was about power. For years, she'd controlled the dynamics of her family, and our decision to break away had threatened that. Still, knowing her motives didn't make the fallout any easier to navigate. By the time we returned home, the situation had escalated. Carol's messages had grown more dramatic, ranging from guilt-tripping pleas, "David, this isn't like you. Your father and I are heartbroken," to outright insults, "You've let her ruin our family traditions. You'll regret this." The texts were bad, but the voicemails were worse. One particularly venomous message had Carol accusing me of manipulating David and tearing him away from his family. "This is what she's always wanted," she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "To isolate you and make you choose her over us." Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. No matter how many times David reassured me, the guilt lingered. What if she was right? What if I was the reason for this rift? David listened to the voicemail with a look of pure disgust. "This is the last time we're letting her do this," he said, deleting the message with a flick of his thumb. She can't keep blaming you for everything wrong in her life. It's not fair, and it's not true. His support kept me grounded, but the fallout was impossible to ignore. The messages, the voicemails, the tension. It was clear that Carol wasn't going to let this go anytime soon. And deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. When we returned home from San Diego, the brief peace we'd found quickly gave way to the storm we knew was coming. Carol, unsurprisingly, wasn't content to let the fallout from our vacation stunt end at angry texts and voicemails. She escalated in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, dragging our private decision into a public spectacle. The first signs of her campaign against me came through mutual friends. A colleague of David's approached him at work, hesitating before asking, "Hey, is everything okay with your mom? She's been, saying some things about my name." "What kind of things?" David pressed, already bracing himself. His colleague shifted uncomfortably. "She mentioned that my name has been controlling and, I think she even said manipulative. Like, keeping you from your family, or something." David came home fuming, recounting the interaction. "She's painting you as some kind of evil mastermind," he said, pacing the living room. "She's trying to turn everyone against you, and me, by extension. This is ridiculous." It didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I started hearing from friends who'd been approached by Carol or one of her sympathizers. The stories varied slightly, but the theme was the same. I was controlling David, tearing him away from his family, and ruining their cherished traditions. The rumor stung, but what hurt more was realizing how far Carol was willing to go to maintain her grip on the family. Then one afternoon, she showed up at our house unannounced. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there she was, her arms crossed, her face a mask of anger and indignation. "I need to speak with David," she said curtly, her eyes barely flicking in my direction. "David's not home," I replied, though my heart raced at the thought of her barging past me to wait for him. She stepped closer, her voice rising. "This is what she's done to you," she spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She's tearing this family apart." Her words dripped with venom, each one carefully calculated to cast me as the villain. I froze for a moment, stunned by the sheer audacity of her accusation. "Carol, this isn't the time," I said firmly, trying to maintain my composure. But before she could continue her tirade, David appeared behind me. He'd pulled into the driveway while she was mid-rant, and I hadn't even noticed. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone cold as he stepped past me to stand in front of her. Carol's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, pointing at me again. "This is what she's done to you. Look at how you've changed. You're distant, disrespectful. You've abandoned your family because of her." David's jaw tightened, and his voice was like steel.
"No, Mom.
"You are the reason this family is falling apart. Not my name."
Not me. You."
"And until you can respect my wife, you're not welcome here." The words hung in the air, heavier than I'd expected. Carol's face twisted, a mix of fury and disbelief. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but David didn't give her the chance. "Leave," he said firmly, stepping back toward the door. "We're done." And just like that, he shut the door in her face. I stood there, still shaken, as he turned to me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening. "I think so," I said, though the truth was more complicated. Seeing David stand up for me like that had been a relief, but the encounter left me rattled. Carol's words echoed in my mind, each accusation cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. David pulled me into a hug, his grip reassuring. "She's not going to win," he said quietly. "She can't control us anymore." I nodded against his chest, trying to absorb the comfort he was offering. But as much as I appreciated his support, I couldn't shake the feeling that Carol's next move would be even worse. It had been a week since Carol's last unannounced visit, and while the tension from that confrontation still lingered, I had hoped she would at least cool off. But that hope was shattered when the doorbell rang again, late one afternoon. I peered through the peephole and felt my stomach drop. Carol was back, and this time, she looked even angrier than before. I hesitated for a moment, weighing whether I should even open the door. But before I could decide, she pounded on it again, her voice muffled but unmistakably furious. "I know you're in there," she yelled. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The second she saw me, her face twisted with rage. Without waiting for an invitation, she pushed past me into the house, her footsteps heavy and purposeful. "Where's David?" she demanded, her voice loud enough to echo through the hallway. I need to speak to my son. He's not home, I said, keeping my tone as even as possible. And you can't just barge in like this, Carol. Don't you tell me what I can and can't do, she snapped, turning on me with wild eyes. I wouldn't have to come here if you hadn't stolen him from me. I froze, her words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. For years, she'd accused me of pulling David away from his family, but now she was saying it outright, her anger boiling over into something almost unhinged. I didn't steal anyone, I said firmly, though my hands were trembling. David made his own decisions. Maybe if you respected those decisions, things wouldn't have gotten to this point. That only seemed to fuel her rage. She stepped closer, her voice rising. Don't you dare turn this around on me. You've been manipulating him from the start, poisoning him against his own family. Do you know what you've done? You've destroyed us. I tried to hold my ground, but her words hit a nerve. You did this to yourself, Carol. I shot back, my voice sharper now. You've been tearing your family apart for years with your controlling, selfish behavior. Don't blame me because David finally stood up to you. Her face twisted with fury, and before I could react, she lunged at me. Her hand grabbed my arm with surprising force, her nails digging into my skin as she screamed incoherently. The sudden violence left me stunned, my body frozen in shock as she continued to yell. Do you think you can just take my son and get away with this? She shrieked, her grip tightening. You're nothing. You'll ruin him just like you've ruined everything else. Before I could even think to fight back, David burst into the room. He must have heard the commotion from outside, and the look on his face was pure fury. Mom, let go of her, he yelled, striding forward and pulling her away from me. Carol stumbled back, her face a mix of shock and defiance. David, she's ruining your life, she cried, reaching out as if to grab him instead. No, he said, his voice cold and steady. You're the one ruining everything. And if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police. The threat seemed to snap her out of whatever rage-fueled haze she was in. She straightened, her face dark with anger, but her movements hesitant now. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice quieter but no less venomous. She's manipulating you, David. You'll see it eventually. Leave, he repeated, stepping between us as she backed toward the door. Carol glared at me one last time, her eyes narrowing. This isn't over, she said, her voice low and filled with menace. I'll fix this, no matter what it takes. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, and for a long moment, the house was silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. David turned to me, his expression softening as he saw the state I was in. Are you okay? He asked, his voice gentle now. I nodded shakily, though my heart was still racing. She grabbed me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think she'd, actually. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. She's gone, he said softly, but there was a steeliness in his tone. And she's not coming back. I'm not letting her do this to you. Or to us again. As I clung to him, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. Carol's behavior had gone from manipulative to outright dangerous, and her parting words left me chilled. This wasn't just a family conflict anymore. It was something darker, something that couldn't be ignored. David stepped back, his jaw set with determination. We're pressing charges, he said, his voice firm. And we're getting a restraining order. This ends now. I nodded, still shaken but grateful for his unwavering support. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. But as much as I wanted to believe this was the end of Carol's interference, I couldn't shake the feeling that her vow to fix things wasn't an empty threat. The morning after Carol's outburst, David and I sat in silence at the kitchen table, the weight of the previous day still heavy in the air. My arm throbbed faintly where she had grabbed me, the bruises already forming a sickly purple. The marks were a tangible reminder of how far things had spiraled. I stared at the police department's website open on my laptop, the words "file a report" staring back at me like a challenge. Filing a police report wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, especially not against a family member. But Carol wasn't just a meddling mother-in-law anymore. She was a threat. David placed a hand over mine, his grip firm but gentle. We have to do this, he said, his voice calm but resolute. She's not going to stop unless we make her. You deserve to feel safe in your own home, and right now we don't. I nodded, swallowing hard as I clicked the link and began the process. I filled out the forms carefully, detailing every moment of her escalation, from the insults to the rumors to her physically attacking me. The words felt surreal as I typed them, as if they belonged to someone else's life.
But this was our reality now.
At the police station later that day, I recounted everything again, this time to a patient officer who nodded as he listened. "This kind of behavior doesn't just go away on its own," he said when I finished. "Filing for restraining order is the right move. Do you feel safe at home right now?" His question hit harder than I expected. I glanced at David before answering, my voice quieter than I intended.
No.
"Not really." The officer gave me an encouraging nod. "Then let's make sure you get the protection you need." His confidence gave me a small sense of relief. We weren't alone in this anymore. The process for the restraining order moved quickly. Between the police report and the photographic evidence of the bruises on my arm, the judge had no hesitation in granting it. Within days, Carol was legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of our home or contacting us in any way. It felt like a victory, albeit a bittersweet one. As much as I hated what it had come to, I knew it was necessary. Carol's behavior had crossed every imaginable line, and this was the only way to ensure she couldn't keep disrupting our lives. But David wasn't done. One evening, as we sat on the couch trying to decompress, he turned to me with a look of determination. "We need a fresh start," he said. "This house, this neighborhood, everything about it feels tainted now. She knows where we live, how to find us. We can't stay here." His words hit me like a gust of wind. The idea of moving felt overwhelming. This was the house where we'd built so many memories, where we'd planned our future together. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. Staying here meant living in the shadow of what Carol had done. A new home could mean a clean slate, free from her looming presence. Within a few weeks, we found a small house on the other side of the city. It wasn't as big as our current home, but it was bright, cozy, and full of potential. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other and kids played outside without a care in the world. It felt safe. It felt like a sanctuary. The decision to move wasn't easy, but the thought of Carol showing up uninvited, or worse, made it feel necessary. Moving day was a whirlwind of emotions. As we packed the last of our boxes, I felt a pang of sadness for the life we were leaving behind. This house had been our first home together, and letting it go felt like closing a chapter one wasn't entirely ready to end. But as we loaded the final box into the truck, I felt something else too, hope. The idea of starting fresh, of creating a new life far from Carol's toxic influence, gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. When we pulled into the driveway of our new home, I felt the tension in my chest begin to loosen. The house wasn't much yet, just an empty shell waiting for us to fill it, but it was ours. As we walked through the front door, David turned to me and smiled.
"This is it," he said.
No more looking over our shoulders. No more worrying about her showing up. "It's just us now." I smiled back, feeling the truth of his words sink in. For the first time in months, the future felt like something we could shape on our own terms. That evening, as we unpacked the essentials, I stood by the window and watched the sunset over the quiet street. The glow of the setting sun painted the walls of our new home in warm, golden hues, and I felt a strange but welcome sense of peace. Carol's shadow still lingered in the back of my mind, but it felt smaller now, less suffocating. We had taken action. We had reclaimed our lives. And in this new space, far from the chaos she had brought into our world, I felt like we could finally begin to heal. With the restraining order officially in place, Carol's grip on our lives began to loosen. Her texts became increasingly frantic at first, each one a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. Messages like, "David, you can't be serious about this," or "How could you let her ruin everything?" pinged his phone at all hours. David silenced her number, without hesitation, his resolve unshaken. "She'll burn herself out," he said one evening as we unpacked boxes in the living room of our new home. "Her anger feeds off attention, and if she doesn't get any from us, she'll move on eventually." I nodded, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Carol didn't seem like the kind of person who simply let things go. Cutting ties with her felt like severing a live wire, necessary, but volatile and unpredictable. At first, I tried not to dwell on it. Our new house gave me plenty of distractions. I threw myself into decorating, carefully choosing colors and furniture that made the space feel warm and inviting. Each detail felt like reclaiming a small piece of our lives, a quiet rebellion against the chaos Carol had brought. David joined in enthusiastically, and for the first time in months, we started to feel like ourselves again. But cutting ties with family, even toxic family, is never as simple as just walking away. David's siblings, caught in the crossfire, weren't as quick to choose sides. While none of them directly condoned Carol's behavior, they also didn't go out of their way to challenge it. "She's still our mom," his younger sister said during a strained phone call. "And she's struggling with how everything happened." David didn't hold back. "She's struggling because she refuses to take responsibility for her actions," he replied sharply. "Her behavior isn't justifiable. She put her hands on my wife, and now she's dealing with the consequences. If you can't see that, I don't know what to tell you." The conversation ended awkwardly, with his sister mumbling something about needing time to think. David hung up and sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's like they're afraid to rock the boat," he said. "They'll bend over backward to avoid upsetting her, but they don't realize she's the one sinking the ship." I tried to focus on the progress we'd made. Carol was no longer showing up unannounced, her messages went unanswered, and her ability to disrupt our daily lives had been effectively neutered. But every so often, I'd catch a flicker of guilt in David's eyes, a shadow of the internal battle he was fighting. Cutting ties with his mother wasn't easy for him, no matter how justified it was. One evening, as we sat on the couch after dinner, I finally brought it up. "Do you regret it?" I asked softly, not entirely sure I wanted to hear the answer. David looked at me for a long moment before shaking his head. "No," he said firmly. "I hate that it came to this, but I don't regret protecting you, protecting us. If I had to do it all over again, I would." I felt a lump rise in my throat, and I reached for his hand. "You've lost so much because of this," I said. "I just don't want you to resent me for it someday." He squeezed my hand tightly. "I haven't lost anything I wasn't willing to let go of," he said. "You're my family. That's all that matters to me." His words stayed with me in the weeks that followed, helping to quiet the nagging doubts that tried to creep in. The process of cutting ties with Carol wasn't just painful for David. It forced me to confront my own feelings of guilt, even though I knew her behavior wasn't my fault. There were moments when I questioned whether we'd made the right choice, whether there was a way to salvage some semblance of a relationship with her. But every time I thought about the years of hurt, the manipulation, and the escalation that had led to this point, I knew there was no going back. Carol's influence over our lives had finally begun to fade, but her presence still lingered like a ghost in the corners of my mind. Cutting ties hadn't erased the scars she'd left behind, but it had given us the space to start healing. And for the first time, I felt like that was enough. Even now, months after the dust has settled, the scars from Carol's toxicity linger. There are moments when her words replay in my mind, sharp and cruel, whispering doubts I thought I'd silenced. Sometimes, when I glance at the faint mark on my arm where she grabbed me, I feel the echo of her anger and manipulation. Those reminders are hard to shake, but they no longer consume me the way they once did. David and I have learned to navigate the aftermath together. Our marriage, once overshadowed by her judgment and interference, now feels like it belongs to us again. For years, I felt like an outsider looking in, desperately trying to earn her approval and find my place in the family. But now, for the first time, I don't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. David's unwavering support has been my anchor, and together we've built something that feels unshakable. Our new home has become a sanctuary in every sense of the word. Each room is a reflection of the life we're creating, one free from Carol's shadow. The living room is filled with laughter and the quiet comfort of shared evenings. The kitchen is alive with the smells of our favorite meals, and the bedroom is our refuge at the end of each day. Every corner of this house feels like a declaration of independence, a space where we can just be. But the road ahead isn't without its challenges. Cutting ties with Carol hasn't erased the pain she caused or the strain her behavior placed on David's relationships with his siblings. While they've largely stayed neutral, their silence often feels like complicity. David struggles with it more than he lets on, though he rarely voices it. He doesn't regret standing up for us, but I know he wishes it hadn't come at the cost of his family connections. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to take each day as it comes. Some days, I feel like we've finally moved on, like Carol is nothing more than a bad memory we've outgrown. Other days, I feel her presence like a weight in the air, a reminder of how deeply she tried to entangle herself in our lives. But no matter how heavy that weight feels, it doesn't crush me anymore. Freedom isn't just about physical distance or legal protections, it's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that someone tried to take away. And that's exactly what David and I are doing. We've reclaimed our happiness, our peace, and our sense of control over our lives. Carol still looms in the background, though her reach is limited now. Every so often, we hear about her from mutual acquaintances, stories of how she paints herself as the victim, twisting the narrative to suit her version of events. At first, those stories made me angry, but now I just feel indifferent. Her attempts to control the narrative don't matter anymore, not to us, and not to the people who truly know and care about us. As I sit on the porch of our new home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I feel a quiet sense of peace. It's not the loud, triumphant kind of victory I once imagined. It's softer, steadier. It's knowing that we survived, that we chose ourselves, and that we came out stronger on the other side. David joins me, handing me a mug of tea as he settles into the chair beside me. "What are you thinking about?" he asks, his voice warm and familiar. I take a sip of the tea, letting the warmth spread through me. "How far we've come," I say simply. He reaches over and takes my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "And how far we'll go," he adds, a smile tugging at his lips. The road ahead is uncertain, but one thing is clear. We're free from Carol's control. And that freedom, hard-won and deeply cherished, is worth everything it took to get here. For the first time in a long time, the future feels like it belongs entirely to us.